All right, so if you've been a part of my channel at all, you've heard me teach many times before. You know that many times I have discussed the idea of the Earth's history and the idea of the 7 days of the Earth's history. It is echoed in prophecies, it's echoed in many writings, the Bible itself and beyond, many pseudepigraphal works. The idea that the Earth's history is divided into 7 parts, and that those 7 parts are each 1,000 years. And so what we're going to be going through today is a timeline of that, so you can see it in front of your eyes, and it all fits together. It makes sense to you, and hopefully it will. So let's get started going through this material. I think there will be some parallels you'll see here. That's probably the biggest thing, is not just seeing the timeline, but then the parallels between the ways God revealed this timeline through history, through the Bible, through the different events that occurred, is just absolutely amazing. So we will do that and start with just the timeline of the Earth's history. And here's our timeline we're going to start with. Obviously very simple. You see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and actually an 8th day outlined. Now we'll get to why there's an 8th day. If you've seen my material before, you may know already, but there are initially the first 7 days of Earth's history. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so we are showing that now. But let's go ahead and let's scroll this over to the side, and what we're going to do is show it little by little so we can go through it together. And note here too that we can map these years to the time of history. So each day being 1,000 years. Now, at the top of each of these date indicators is the years in AM calculation. Now, AM is Anno Mundi, so it's a way of calculating the date based on the beginning of creation, the start of the world. And then below that would be the corresponding date in our calendar. So you can see that 0 Anno Mundi corresponds with 5500 BC. And the way we get to that date specifically, by the way, is that we start with the Septuagint, it being essentially one of the oldest versions of the scriptures that we've got, has that as the starting point for the timelines and the genealogies that make up the history before Christ. So the creation of the world really happened about 5,500 years before Christ. And so that's why we start with this here. But you can see as they move through history, goes forward, when it's 5000 AM Anno Mundi calendar, it's 500 BC in our calendar. But you see how that works. I just wanted to explain that before we get started. So you see and you note that in the very beginning, at 0 Anno Mundi, that we have the creation of the earth. And you note that I have the cross there. Well, the reason I have the cross there is because, as we know from scriptures, that before the foundation of the world, that Christ was begotten by the Father. Jesus, his Son, was begotten by him. So there was a time when Christ came out from the Father. And that according to John chapter 1, that Jesus Christ was instrumental in the creation of the world. So that is why Christ is here at the beginning, and you'll note that I have the word Alpha above the cross, because he was the beginning. And as we know from the scriptures, he was both the Alpha and the Omega. Now this was Jesus Christ, this was not the Father. Jesus Christ was the Alpha and the Omega. And you're going to see what that means as we move forward. If we go into the 2nd day, you'll note that even within the first day of Earth's history, the first 1,000 years, Adam did pass away. Now, if you remember from the Garden of Eden, when God told him and Eve not to eat the fruit, he said, if you eat this fruit, you will die in the day in which you eat it. Now, that word day in Hebrew is the word yom, and it does not always mean a specific 24-hour day. But as many of the prophecies were given in Hebrew, in Yom, These were the 1,000-year periods that are talked about in the prophecies. And so when God told Adam that he would die in the day he ate that fruit, it literally came to pass. It wasn't a symbolic reference to his spiritual death. It was nothing of the sort. It was actually a very literal consequence that God gave Adam, that he would die within the first 1,000 years after he ate the fruit. And yes, he did do that. He died at the age of 930 years old. So within that first day, Adam passes away because of eating the fruit. And you'll see in the second day now, ancient writings somewhat like the book of Enoch, they call this like an age of wickedness, an age of evil, essentially. And so that second day is, of course, the time in which, if you'll remember, and it's all in the book of Genesis in the Bible, the book of Genesis, actually, the history in that book spans a few thousand years, whether you realize it or not. We read it usually very quickly, and we think all of that must have happened very fast. But if we take the time to study the events in that book, and we use the timelines and genealogies of the Septuagint, then we notice that it was a few thousand years between, for instance, Adam and the flood. And during that 1,000 years or so, especially the second 1,000 years of Earth history, this is when the Nephilim were on Earth. You see, in the middle of that 1,000-year period, Enoch is translated to heaven. That's about when that occurred. And so that is around the time of what is called in the Bible the days of Jared, where the Nephilim were produced because fallen angels came down to human women and caused them to procreate, and they bore the giants. So this is the time frame of that. It's why Enoch calls this the age of wickedness, an age of evil, because of all the rampant evil that was going on because of the Nephilim on the earth. Now, if we move further into the third day, you'll note that we now see that the flood of Noah did occur near the intersection of the second and third day. And there's obviously some probability that some of our dating is not perfect for some of these events. It's highly possible that the flood of Noah could have ended at the end of the second 1,000 years, at the beginning of the third. Or this could be very accurate, but it's just very hard to know these things for sure. So we do see that the flood of Noah occurred in the third day here. I put it around 2300 AM or 3200 BC. And then at the very end of the third day, you have the Tower of Babel occurrence, okay? So between that time, a lot of things happen. After the flood occurs, of course, Noah and his family starts to repopulate the earth. But by the time of the Tower of Babel, Nimrod has come to power, and essentially Babylon is up and coming. And the Tower of Babel is produced by these people to try to, as I believe it, barge into heaven, to break into heaven. Now we get into the fourth and fifth day ages of the earth's history. We start to see now Israel has come about. After the Tower of Babel and everything, then Abraham and the stories there surrounding Abraham, and then Jacob and Joseph. And so Israel starts in the middle of that 4,000 years. And then, of course, the bondage in Egypt and the Exodus occurs around the end of the fourth day age. They do enter the promised land and then build Solomon's temple in this time period. Now we're getting into the sixth day age. Between the start and the middle of the sixth day age is the Babylonian captivity. You can see there kind of at the top. This occurs because the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, not Herod's temple, the first temple, Solomon's temple, was sieged by Nebuchadnezzar. All of the Israelites went into captivity in Babylon at that time. And so they stayed there for about 500 years worth until they were actually able to come back in and start to rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem and the walls around it. Of course, we read about that in Nehemiah. But in the middle of that sixth-day age is, of course, the year 5500 Anno Mundi calendar, or what we call 0 AD, the year of the birth or the advent of Jesus Christ. And so in the middle of that sixth day is when Jesus came to the earth. And as I've talked about in my previous videos, the Day of the Lord seems to be the name for this day of history. The Day of the Lord from 500 BC to about 500 AD. We saw nation after nation topple before the Lord God of the heavens. And in the middle of that day age, he brings Christ to become the new ruler to replace all of these other rulers that were being toppled by God. He gives the authority to his son, Jesus Christ, who then becomes king of all. Now, note back here, there's something that I probably didn't but could have put on this. Remember the Tower of Babel. So if we look back at the Tower of Babel in the end of the third day age, the beginning of the fourth, when the nations were split at the Tower of Babel, the Bible, specifically in the Septuagint and other versions that take the Bible's writing more literally and literally translate it, they say that the sons of man were split at the Tower of Babel based on the angels of God. And what it's talking about there is that humanity was split up into essentially nations, ethnos, at that time, and they were each given over to a separate principality angel. So when we then see during the fourth and fifth day age, when God is talking through the prophets in the scriptures, we read it in the Bible, and he's talking through the prophets, he's talking about the nations, and he's talking about Egypt and Tyre and Sidon and Edom and all these nations. He's talking about and to many times these principality angels that are over the nations as they were broken up at the Tower of Babel. Because what other prophets like Enoch have said about those principalities is that they kind of went rogue. They worked against God, and not only did they usurp God as far as try to usurp his power, but they also treated his people, the people of God, the Israelite nation, they treated them incorrectly, with wickedness, and as many of the prophecies say, they slew the people of God. They slew many of the Israelites as they were in captivity. It mentions them dealing with them treacherously. And so God was going to have his vengeance. And his, quote, day of vengeance was this sixth day age, the day of the Lord, in which he would take back the earth from those principalities, take back humanity, and make a new kingdom, the one kingdom to rule all kingdoms. And that was the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. Who was going to make that kingdom and start it and build it? It was Jesus Christ. And as Jesus came first to the Jewish nation, and then essentially the gospel went to all nations, his intent was to bring the Jewish people, the Israelites, back to God, and also then extend the inheritance of the nations to all people all over the earth, and then create the kingdom of God, establish it for him. And in the end, as we hear in 1 Corinthians 15, deliver that to God, deliver all the kingdom of the world to God, the kingdom of heaven to God. So it's amazing what we see here. As throughout the last 4,000 years, we had angels intervening in history in wicked ways. First with Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, and producing the Nephilim and the giants, giving humanity tools with which to work magic and work war and destruction and death. And then those same types of entities, the principalities of the nations, in the fourth day age and the fifth day age, then leading nations astray and dealing wickedly with God's people. Of course, God would want his vengeance against those angels. They needed divine intervention. They needed punishment for their wickedness. And that is what the day of the Lord was all about. We see, again, when these kingdoms are falling, we see Babylon fall. We see Egypt fall. We see Persia fall. We see Greece fall. We see then, of the next 500 years after Christ, we see Rome fall. The most consequential political entity in known history up to that point, Rome, falls around 400 to 500 AD. The consequences are just so understated of what happened at that time. And that's part of what my understanding, my research has led me to understand, is the consequential nature of what God did during this time period. And even, as it mentions here, the temple of the Jews was destroyed at this time. Why is that? Because they had gone astray. Okay, so Christ came back to all the Jewish provinces throughout Galilee and the area of Jerusalem, and he was bringing them back to God, as many as would come, but only a remnant came back. And because the rest were wicked, God, again, just like he took vengeance on these other nations, he must take vengeance on his own nation of Israel. And to do that, he allows Rome to come against Israel in 70 AD and literally destroy the temple that was the foundation of their worship and practice of the law. Of course, Jesus had been saying since he came upon the earth during his ministry that he had been the fulfillment of that law anyway. So the remnant that understood who Christ was understood that they no longer needed those things to follow Christ, to understand who God was, that those things were a shadow of Christ, as you can read for yourself in the book of Hebrews very plainly. So this is a very super consequential time period that I don't think our historians or our teachers or our pastors give any credence to whatsoever. They simply look past it, don't understand it, don't take time. Christ was the centerpiece of God's vengeance against the nations. He was the establishment, the king who came to rule and build the kingdom for God and establish it forever, in place of all these wicked principalities, nations that had existed since before the flood. All right, so moving forward now into the seventh day age. Now, there's silence on this time period. It's called a Sabbath. Of course, the seventh day of a week is the Sabbath, right? And of course, we know about the binding of Satan happening for 1,000 years. Now, you'll see here that I have a few different possibilities for the binding of Satan. It's one of the things I'm a little unsure about, just because nobody specifically talks about it, except just a couple references in different writings. So my jury is a little bit out, but I tend to lean towards that Satan was bound at the defeat of Rome, essentially, Mystery Babylon, and that he was bound for 1,000 years. So that would have started at about 500 AD at the fall of Rome and lasted for 1,000 years, close to the end of the seventh day age. That entire seventh day age being a Sabbath age, a Sabbath day, a day of rest. And if you look in history, that time period certainly appears to be like that. We don't see, again, what we saw during the day of the Lord, the sixth day age, where God was waging war from heaven against nation after nation, destroying them with fire, blood rain, earthquakes, pestilences, plagues. We don't see that as much after 500 AD. So I believe that Sabbath day age was literally fulfilled by God, and that he didn't intervene in history during that age much at all. Not in a prophetic way. It was a time of rest. And Satan being bound, it was a time of rest and peace for the earth in general. And now we have to think of that peace and rest in the context of many, many nations. our history books will try to focus that time period in on Rome. Okay, you'll note that if you study this time period between 500 AD and 1500 AD, they revolve everything around Rome. Now, there's a reason for that, because after the Holy Roman Empire was established, it wanted everyone to think that it was the incarnation of Rome, the original Rome that God had defeated. But so they kind of mold our view of history to look at it from Rome's perspective. But we have to realize that all over the earth at this time, and I recognized this when I was studying the genesis of Islam, the beginnings of Islam and Muhammad, that many of the writings surrounding that time period say that all of Arabia knew about Jesus and God. The word of Jesus Christ and his work and his ministry and his death and resurrection had spread throughout the known world. So, of course, that's in the early 7th century, 620 or so AD, that they were saying all of Arabia knows all about God and Christ, although many of them were still pagan in some way. Many of them had turned to Christianity as well. So you just have to realize that by the Sabbath time period, Christianity had spread all over the world. And so we have to look at that in the context of all countries, not just Rome. And if we allow the Roman texts, the Roman history books, to drive our perceptions of all of this, especially after the time in which Rome was defeated, then I think we run into a lot of problems, okay? Because that is their modus operandi, is to make us see everything in history through the lens of the Roman Catholic Church, which is incorrect. But after that seventh-day age, where there was this Sabbath period of silence and peace throughout the world, we have the end of the seventh. Now, that would have been, that's the end of the 7-day ages, the week of Earth's history. Now, we'll talk more about the 8th day. If you've seen, I do have a separate video on the 8th day specifically. It's represented in many places in the scriptures and in other writings and in early Christian writings. But the 8th day age seems to be something that's outside of Earth history in this sense, that it represents a coming age of spirituality. But where this puts everything is that the short season during which Satan is now unbound, okay, Satan was bound for 1,000 years. I tend to believe that did end at the end of the Sabbath age. And so at the beginning of the 8th day age would have started the short season, meaning the season in which Satan is again loosed on the earth and able to, as it says, deceive the nations once again. But in that middle of that day age, now, again, there's a lot going on here. Many of the Christian texts after Christ call this time, this 1,000 years after the Sabbath period, they call it the day of Christ. They often will call it the day of the Lord. If you look at the translation in the Greek for that, the day of the Kurios, Lord, they are talking about Christ. That's different than the prophets in the Old Testament. They were talking about Yahweh. They were talking about God the Father. So when they prophesied the day of the Lord, they were talking about the 6th day age, during which Christ's advent would occur and that God would have vengeance on the nations. Now, as we move then into the Christian period, the Christians were talking about the day age of Christ, which would be after the Sabbath, during which the great white throne judgment of Revelation 20 would occur. So what I believe, as I've read through all these texts, and this does build on work from a number of videos that I have released, and you can always go back and watch those on the day of the Lord or the great white throne judgment. I have videos on both of those to fully explain what happens. But I believe in the middle of this 8th day age, which is set to be a spiritual age, that Christ will again appear at the great white throne judgment. The Christians throughout the time period of even the apostles forward called this the coming of Christ. His advent had already occurred. He was already with them to a point and had established the kingdom. But when they talked about his coming, They were talking about the great white throne judgment at the end. And that this 1,000 years would exist after the great white throne judgment occurs. The earth is remade, as you see there at the top. Jesus comes. The saints are gathered to him, and the great white throne judgment occurs. And all of this also occurs in context with a bathing of the earth in fire that lays it all bare, cleanses the entire earth, and makes it ready to be remade by God and Christ. And that this age, and you'll recognize some of you from my video on the eschatology of the early church fathers, that I mentioned Papias. Papias is one that we have very little fragments of writing from, but in his fragments we do have a statement that Papias believed that Christ would reign on earth for 1,000 years, essentially with the saints. Now, in the context of the great white throne judgment, that makes sense. It's this 8th day age during which the great white throne judgment would occur, the earth would be remade, and then Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem from heaven, would come down, rest on the earth, and then man would live with God on the new earth for 1,000 years. So this is what is talked about by the early Christians. And again, you can kind of see why I think a lot of people get some of these things so confused, is because there's different terms. We don't understand the difference between the Hebrew and the Greek. And when things are occurring, we kind of mush up the time contexts and we don't see it as clearly as we should. But when you mete out all of these things, you divide them out, you settle on, okay, that's what's being talked about here. This is what's being talked about here. This is the picture it paints. Again, that at the great white throne judgment and the remaking of earth, that Christ will gather the saints to him, the wicked will be destroyed, and that the earth will be refashioned so that then God, quote, God and man can exist together. Okay, so this is beyond the, quote, history of earth. And we will see this more as we start to look at the parallels between this timeline and a bunch of other things that God did through history to kind of show this. So that's where we'll go next. But to just let you at least see this in totality, there is what we've just gone over. The 7 days of earth history, and including an 8th day that is talked about in prophecy as well. So I hope that gives you a good overview of the whole thing altogether. Again, the only things on this chart that I even have any sort of question or doubt on, and I'm trying to be very transparent with you, is the binding of Satan. Again, I had these other kind of ghosted brackets to show that it's possible, though not likely to me, that Satan could have been bound nearer to the time of Christ's death and resurrection, or possibly, as some of the early Christians or even later Christians had said, possibly during the fall of Rome, like in the middle of it, kind of when the persecution of Christianity stopped. Particularly John Fox, he says that they feel that the end of the persecution of Christians is when Satan was bound. Now that's an interesting concept. Again, that would kind of put the binding of Satan at about 320 AD-ish, and then lasted, of course, for 1,000 years into that Sabbath period. But it would, of course, end just shy of the Sabbath end. But again, as I looked at it further and further, the more I felt like, especially according to the book of Revelation itself, is that when the final defeat of Rome came, Babylon and Rome, and we're talking about Revelation 17, 18, 19 here, that was when Satan would be bound and that 1,000 years would commence. And of course, that would coincide with the fall of Rome in the 4th and 5th century. And I will say this too, as far as transparency, and if there was some question to me whether or not not the 6th day age, but this day of the Lord idea, the day of the Lord that is here above the cross in the 6th day age. There was at first some question for me as to whether that started at 500 BC to 500 AD and coincided with the fall of Rome, or if it started at the time of Christ and went out 1,000 years from that. And that would have put it from the middle of the 6th day age to the middle of the 7th. But things didn't seem to line up as well, particularly the judgments that were called out in the Old Testament against the nations. When you hear the judgments talking about against Egypt, now Egypt mostly fell prior to Christ, so that wouldn't have fit if we moved the day of the Lord out to start at the advent of Christ and go forward 1,000 years. So to make sure all of the fulfillments were inside the day of the Lord, it seemed proper and correct for it to start at about the time when the prophets went silent. Do you notice that? About the time the prophets went silent, about 500 years before Christ, is when I believe the day of the Lord started and continued, and that Christ was the centerpiece marker of that day, of this destruction against the nations, where God was taking the earth back and then putting a new king in place over these principalities that had ruled prior to Christ. So with that said and that done, we're now going to start going through some of the parallels that we have in both the scriptures and with other writings about what matches this. How did God foreshadow this? There's actually a lot of different ways that God foreshadowed this. And it will match so well, I think it will be shocking in some ways to you. So I'm going to take the dates off of the bottom of the timeline. I'm going to hide the dates. And what we'll do now is start to add these parallel timelines to the bottom of this chart, so you can see how it matches up perfectly. The first of that is that we're going to put creation week on the timeline, because as both the early Christians and some of the prophets said, that God created the earth in 7 days for a reason, and it was to foreshadow the 7,000 years of Earth's history. Okay, and so it's interesting if we do, as some people do, they take Genesis 1 and they'll actually map Genesis 1 against these day ages of the earth, or rather just against the days of creation. And so I take that a step further. I map that against the day ages of creation. But you see here, and just below these light green boxes, you'll see the Hebrew of Genesis 1:1, and it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim wa et haaretz. Okay, and what it's saying, of course, is in the beginning, or at the primary, God made, Elohim made the heavens and the earth. Okay, so when we look at the day ages in comparison to that, starting with the first day age, in the first day of creation, God created light and dark. And so how does that make sense with the first day age of mankind, perhaps, or in history? Well, to me, it sounds like it does relate, because this is the age in which, of course, Adam first sinned and brought sin into the world. What was the sin, and what was the consequence of the sin? What God said to Adam was that he had eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, light and dark. He had brought himself down to a world and a way of existing between good and evil, between light and darkness, that he was never meant to do. He was never meant to be a part of. So because of that sin, he now exists in a world of light and dark, of sin and goodness, sin and righteousness, good and evil. Then in the second day age, God created the waters and the firmament. Okay, all the different things he did by separating the waters and laying in the firmament between heavens and earth. That was all done during the second day of creation. And it's interesting that that's during this age of wickedness day, the day 2 of the 7,000 years of history. So the second 1,000 years of history, during which the angels fornicated with women and came from the heavens, from the firmament down to the earth, and created the Nephilim, the giants. And then, of course, what happens to remedy that? Well, the firmament breaks open and waters pour forth, both from the firmament and from under the earth, and the flood of Noah occurs to take care of that wickedness. Okay, and as we said before, that flood of Noah, again, it does seem to happen just at the end or the beginning of the third 1,000 years, but still applies probably to this second day age. Now, during the third 1,000 years, third day age, during the third day of creation, God created the land and the plants. Well, after the flood of Noah, it was about the regrowth of earth. He had essentially, as the Bible puts it, he had cleansed the earth by water. And so now the land and the plants come into play because they're now regrowing. The whole earth is being rebuilt. Now, in the fourth day age, just after the Tower of Babel occurs, you'll note that the fourth day of creation, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, as we talked about before, this is the age in which God allowed the principalities to rule over the nations. And if you know even what I've taught, or whether you've done some research into the way that people worshiped these gods in the past, they worshiped them with the symbols of the sun and the moon and the stars. So it's interesting that on this fourth day of creation, both God created those sun, moon, and stars, and during that age of the earth, people were worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars and the principalities as gods. Just very interesting correspondence there. Now, in the fifth day of creation, God created animals, okay? And so I don't know if there's a direct correlation between that and what was going on with Israel in that time period. You know, perhaps it has some correlation to the sacrificial system of Israel. You know, they sacrificed animals. Perhaps, again, it could be a reference to the idea of an animal or a beast is also kind of a reference to either demonic activity or spiritual activity in prophecy. So it could also be related again to those principality angels. But anyway, the fifth day was when God created the animals. The sixth day age is when God created man. And of course, what did God do in the sixth day age of history? He brought Christ to redeem man. He also waged war against the nations to break man out from the bondage of wicked rulership, wicked authority from high places. So in this sixth day age, corresponding to the sixth day of creation where God created man, he brought the second man, Adam, Christ himself, through a virgin, to then redeem mankind. And then, of course, the seventh day of creation, as it should, it mirrors what happened in history perfectly. It was the Sabbath. It was when God rested. Just as that same day age was in Earth's history when God rested, and there was just not much intervention by God into history, or by Christ into history during that time period. So very interesting. It's a perfect correspondence, and the reason it is because it was prophesied to be that way. It's why God did it. So he created the earth in 7 days in effort to correspond to exactly what we're talking about here. So I hope that is very visible and easy to see for you. But so that's the creation week correspondence to the 7 days of Earth's history. Now, by the way, we really haven't scratched the surface, so stick with me. We've got quite a bit more to go. and it gets a little more consequential as we go. So just keep that in mind. The next thing we're going to look at is how Israel itself, the history of Israel, corresponds to the 7 days of creation, or the 7 days of Earth history. So I brought up Israel on the bottom of our timeline, and Without specifically corresponding specific dates, I'm trying to see the major events that occurred in Israel and when, and then kind of see, does that correspond to this 7 days of earth history? So the first thing I think about when I'm thinking about Israel is its creation, and that starts with Abraham and then Jacob or Israel, and then their bondage in Egypt. Now, all of that I'm putting in day 1 because it seems to correspond to this kind of idea of sin. Bondage in Egypt, by the way, was always kind of it was related to sin in prophecy. It was related to bondage to sin, to the slavery to sin. You know, all the efforts with unleavened bread during their rituals and practices too. But so I put in this first day age, again, the day age in which Adam sinned and brought sin into the life of humanity. And humanity is now wrestling with sin in this first day age. That is the same to me as when Abraham and Israel began, and then they went into bondage in Egypt. In the second day age, you know, the second major time period in Israeli history was their exodus, of course, to Canaan, the wilderness, and then their entry into Canaan. And they're, of course, having to fight all the Canaanite groups there. But again, that to me seems to correspond a little bit to the day age 2 of the age of wickedness, as we call it, during which the Nephilim were born and the fallen angels came down to earth. Again, the exodus to Canaan was about, a lot of it was about these Canaanites, and they were actually the progeny of those Nephilim people. So very interesting correlation there. In the third time period of the Israeli nation, I felt that the next thing they really struggled with after they went into Canaan and then were there and established in the, quote, promised land, is they then started to struggle with idol worship. They started to actually take on some of the pagan practices of those pagan nations, if you remember. And they started moving away from God. Now, the interesting thing is that corresponds then with the third day age, during which, after the flood of Noah, they again started procreating over the land, and then slowly came into this situation where Nimrod was ruling Babylon, and they were all a part of that. The same idol worship that was occurring in that time, during the time just before the Tower of Babel, the Israelites were swept up into pagan idol worship during the third time period of their history. Now, the fourth thing I thought of with the Israelites was then God brought the judges to help them. Now, the judges could correspond to, in the same fourth day age, those principality angels that were existing in the 4,000 years of history, that were ruling over the people wickedly. But God had put judges in place over the people of Israel. And so it just seemed to be an interesting correspondence. And actually, in some of the ancient writings, these principalities were called judges or princes. So very interesting correlation there. In the fifth time period of the Israelite nation, the next thing that really occurs is that their temple is destroyed. Now, this is not the temple of Herod in 70 AD. This is the temple of Solomon, and it was destroyed in about 586 BC. But now you can see the timelines kind of coinciding, because Israel's coming up on the same Solomonic temple, and then the Babylonian captivity and expulsion, all that stuff going on here in the same time periods. And then in the sixth age of Israel, we see Israel returning to Jerusalem. Now, in the sixth day age, we had Christ come and give Israel and all Gentiles an option to reconcile themselves to God, to be again reconciled to the Father, to fix their relationship. So in the same time period in the Israeli history, Israel is able to return to Jerusalem and given an opportunity to rebuild Jerusalem and to go back to how they had worshiped God before, how they had been righteous before, how they had been holy before and set apart from the other nations, to come out of Babylon. So God did give them an opportunity to come back into their land and rebuild in the way that they should have. Now, they really ended up not doing that, but we're going to see that more in a second. So in the seventh day age, after Israel had been established and returned to Jerusalem, they did have a waiting period. It was between Christ's ascension and 70 AD. That was the time period the Jews had to fix themselves before judgment, right? And that seemed to be a period of silence. It was a 40-year waiting period, just as had been foreshadowed by the 40 years in the wilderness when they came out of Egypt. So they had a waiting period of 40 years of silence, which you could see as a Sabbath type period of rest. And then in the 8th period that I identified for Israel, 70 AD was their judgment. It was the end for Israel. It was their last opportunity. They lost it. So in that way, I believe that judgment for Israel in 70 AD reflects the coming great white throne judgment for all humanity. That was essentially kind of like their great white throne. That was their judgment. Their temple destroyed. The wicked ones of them essentially taken to Hades. But the righteous ones, the remnant, given a chance to reconcile themselves to God. And so to me, 70 AD and what occurred there does reflect what will occur at the final judgment in a very strong way, but simply for the Israelis, for the Jews and the nation of God. So there's that parallel with Israel. I feel like it's probably a pretty good one. It seems to match pretty well. Now, I did go ahead and put the days of creation on there as well, just so you can see that. It does seem to also, again, they all seem to correspond. So when we talk about the first day age of earth and the sin involved, we talk about the bondage of Israel and Egypt, and then we talk about that light and dark, good and evil were a part of that. The Exodus to Canaan, the Exodus and then their move into Canaan for Israel, again, during the age of wickedness of the Nephilim, and the water and firmament and all of that kind of combining to paint a picture. But you can see how the idol worship at this time, corresponding to the land and the plants. What were the idols? What were the idols said to be? They were said to be dead wood that could not speak or talk. So God chastised them for worshiping the land and the plants, the wood that they made their idols of. So just interesting correspondence there. Again, when we talked about the judges, I likened the judges to the principalities of the nations. And then, of course, the sun, moon, and stars is the same parallel for the days of creation. And again, in the 6th day age, we have man in the creation week, and we have Israel returning to Jerusalem with one last chance to fix themselves. They're given an opportunity. And they do not, for the most part, take it. And then the day of rest is the waiting period before the final judgment for Israel. And that final judgment came in 70 AD. I hope you guys see the parallels coming to life. There's a few more that are quite stark and amazing. We're going to start now with the circumcision, the idea of circumcision. This will be a brief one, but we've talked about this in my other videos. The idea of circumcision was linked to this idea of the ages of earth and specifically the 8th day of earth. You know, in circumcision, on the first day a baby is born, a male child is born. Okay, and this is what circumcision is all about. He's seen as unclean through all the first 7 days of his life. Now, the reason is because the woman is seen as unclean during birth because of the blood and all of that. And so the baby is seen as unclean and kept as unclean until the end of the 7th day. Now, that's interesting because each of these days represents a time period in the history of earth, the history of flesh and material. And the baby is seen as unclean or sinful, if you will, because he is a part of that. He is flesh. Now, what happens in the 8th day of circumcision is that the baby is circumcised. The flesh, the quote, flesh is removed. And that corresponds to the 8th day of history beyond the 7, because it's not any longer fleshly, it's spiritual. The 8th day is a spiritual day in which in history, humanity will become spiritual and will no longer exist in the flesh the way we do. And so circumcision is performed at the beginning of the 8th day for a male child, and he is then seen as clean after that. Again, prior to that, being in the flesh is unclean, and after that is spiritual, and it is clean. So that is what circumcision is and how it relates to that same idea of the 7 days plus the 8th. Now, I do have a whole video on this topic, but we're going to talk about the parallels here of the Battle of Jericho. So what we're going to do is zoom here on the first day age, and we're going to start to talk about in Joshua chapter 6, where the Battle of Jericho is described. Of course, the Israelites had come into the land of Canaan, the promised land, and they saw these giant races, giant peoples. And the race of Jericho was one of those. They were giants. They were not normal humans. They weren't 6 foot tall. They were much taller. And so they were very frightened. But God gave them instructions and gave Joshua instructions on how to conquer these people. He said that each day they would circle the city. Okay, the city, by the way, if you've never seen Jericho, they have unearthed Jericho. They have in archaeology found where Jericho was. It was on a kind of a mound, I wouldn't say a big hill, but it was a mound. So it was raised up above the land surrounding, but it was circular. And so it was very circular, kind of an oval shape, and it had a wall all around it. And so they were to walk around this wall once each day for 7 days. The order of the procession they were supposed to go in was first the army or the armed men would walk, and then behind them would be the priests with their trumpets. And then behind the priests with the trumpets would be the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the important thing, too, is to remember what these things represent. You have armed men and then priests with trumpets. In this case, we can see this as a representation of armed men as humanity and the priests with trumpets as the angels with the trumps of God. Okay, the 7 angels of Revelation. The Ark of the Covenant represents, of course, the Holy of Holies or God's presence. Okay, so this was about ushering in God's presence. Okay. Now, in the first day age, as you see, they would circle once around with this procession. They would circle once. The people were told to remain silent. Don't raise your voices. But then the trumpets would be blown. And it's a little unclear in the passage, but it seems like they would blow the trumpets at the end of the procession. Then on day 2, they would do the same thing. On all the days through day 6, they would do the same thing. Circle once, people stay silent, and the trumpets are blown. But then on day 7, they were to circle 7 times. Again, the number 7, of course, representing the 7 days of history, always. So if you're reading the Bible and you ever see 7 mentioned, you can almost be 100% assured that it represents the 7 days of history, the week of Earth history. In general, you could think of it as when you see the number 7, it represents all of Earth, everything, all of history together. But on that 7th day, they would circle 7 times with this procession, and then the trumpets would be blown at the end of each procession around. So just as they had done prior days, they would go around and then blow the trumpets, and they would go around again 7 times. And then on the last time, then all the people would shout. Okay? So this was the only time during the 7 days the people were allowed to shout and yell. And then what happens? Then the walls of Jericho fall down flat. They fall out and they fall to the ground. There is someone that's saved out of Jericho, and that's Rahab and her family. Why? Because she had helped the spies, and they had promised to save her and her family, and she had put the red ribbon on her door, right? So they would know where that was Rahab's family, and to save all that were inside that building. So Rahab's family is saved. Then the city is burned to the ground. Everything's burned, 100%. And then from the rubble, then everything that doesn't burn, meaning gold, silver, jewels, precious things, would be then gathered up, and the Israelites would keep those. Okay? So, a few things to note here, if you're not already just blown away by what we just said. Note that the people were only allowed to shout on the last trump sound, after the last trump sound on the last day, the end of the seventh day. Well, we know, according to the great white throne judgment, that fire will fall on the earth, and that all humanity will die from fire, and there will be a great cry, especially among the wicked, specifically among the wicked. So all the people shouted on the seventh day. And then what happened? The walls fell down. The barrier between the outside and the inside of earth, or of Jericho, was broken down. There was no barrier any longer. Okay. Now we can see that. It's interesting, if you are of the persuasion that our cosmology is a flat earth cosmology, then you know that the cosmology of the earth is that it is a circular flat plane. And the city of Jericho represents the circular flat plane 100% perfectly. That's exactly what it looked like. So the barrier between earth and heaven is broken down. The walls are torn down. And the same thing happens at the great white throne judgment. The barrier between earth and heaven is shattered. The sky rolls back like a scroll. God and Christ appear in the sky. Now, one more amazing thing, if we're corresponding this correctly to the great white throne judgment, you'll note this here. This gave me goosebumps. It's giving me goosebumps right now. Rahab's family was saved from this. Now, what does that tell us? Rahab's family, under the mark of the scarlet sash, the scarlet ribbon, her family, just like Christians at the great white throne judgment, will be under the blood of Christ. We will be marked and saved by the blood of Christ. Rahab's family was saved from that destruction. And I believe Christianity will be saved out of that destruction. We're not necessarily going to go through it. Before I studied Jericho again in the context of this correspondence, this correlation to the eighth day and the great white throne judgment, I wasn't sure whether or not Christianity would go through that fire judgment, or the remaking of earth would just sweep over everybody, or whether Christians would be taken out of that somehow. There was a couple texts that I studied that seemed to be a little bit at odds with each other on that particular point, so I just withheld my judgment. But now, seeing what happens in Jericho, that of all the people in this city, Jericho, that represents earth, that Rahab's family is saved because of the red blood of the Savior. So I believe that Christians in the end will be saved from the wrath of the great white throne judgment, that we go to be with Christ in the air. Then what happened to the city as the great white throne judgment talks that and says that fire will come over the whole earth and cleanse it? Well, the entire city of Jericho was burned to the ground. Everything was burned. The only things that made it through the fire was the gold and the silver and the priceless things that could withstand it. Now, I believe in that same way during the great white throne judgment, there is talk, of course, and you know this, about that all mankind would then be judged on their deeds. And I believe that some people may make it through that fire because of who they are, and that they perhaps there's some sense in which God understands or allows them to participate somehow and does not send them to everlasting damnation. But only those things that will withstand the fire, meaning spiritual things. And the connection between those things and a person's deeds being judged. Apparently, that doesn't seem to be the case for Christians, according to some of the parallels we're seeing here. But it's just interesting that through that fire, the only things that remain are those things that are refined by fire. What's refined by fire and not destroyed? Well, spiritual things. Gold, silver is the representation of those things with the story of Jericho. So I hope that you see that as clearly as I do. The parallels there are just striking for Jericho and what happens. Now that we've gone through Jericho, there's just a couple more things we're going to talk about. The last set of parallels against the ages of earth is actually going to surprise you, I think. But the week of the crucifixion of our Savior, Jesus Christ. It's getting hard to do this. So if we just take the days of the week of the crucifixion of Christ and we start looking against this timeline, we see in the first day of that week, that's when Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, on a colt, as the king of earth, being presented to earth as its rightful king, being presented to the people of Jerusalem as their king. He enters, and the people with him surround him in front and behind, and they lay down palm branches, and they sing Hosanna to the Lord. Monday of that week, he stays in Bethany overnight, and he comes back during the day, and on Monday, Jesus cleanses the temple. He throws out the money changers, okay? And so he's in the temple for most of the day. And at the end of that day, Jesus gives the Olivet Discourse. The third day of the week is a preparation day. Now, you know that, of course, Passover is occurring in this week. So the third day is, even the Jews in the Gospels say, they wanted to kill Jesus, but they didn't want to cause any mayhem during Passover. So they said, because it's preparation day, we're not going to do anything to Christ today. We're not going to do anything until after Passover. So they weren't going to mess with him until after Passover had started, okay? But Tuesday of that day, there's nothing recorded in the Bible as far as what Christ may have done that day, but it was a preparation day for Passover. Then on Wednesday, at the end of the day, at the end of Wednesday, which was the 14th of Nisan, and this is in 30 AD. And by the way, I want you to know that I studied a good bit on which year do they think that this correct Passover occurred that coincided with Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. And I leaned heavily on the book of Mark for my understanding of this week. I also compared it to the book of Matthew. And then I looked also at a chart that I had found online of the different days on which Passover fell for those years between like 28 and 35 AD. So you could see how it fell each year and whether it lined up with what was being talked about in the scriptures themselves. The only year I found that lined up perfectly with what Mark and Luke said about that week was 30 AD. And this confirms a suspicion that I've had for a long time, that the idea that Christ died and resurrected in 33 AD is a Masonic trope. Okay, it's a Masonic idea. They changed the year as they reported it intentionally to kind of, put their stamp of evil on it, to try to, again, obscure truth and move away from the correct year. I believe the correct year seems like it was 30 AD. And that's just my own opinion based on what I have studied so far. But on this Wednesday, which I believe was the 14th of Nisan and was the start of Passover, if you read about Passover, what happens is the only thing that happens on this day is at the end of the day, they slay the lamb, the Passover lamb. So they did do that in Jerusalem at this time. And so at dusk, at the actual start of the next day, the 15th of Nisan, the Lamb of God was slain and sacrificed by the priests. Now, this doesn't correspond specifically to Jesus' death, but in this case, so Jesus didn't die on the same day that the Passover lamb was slain in this week. That didn't happen. Okay, it didn't happen it didn't happen at all. It just didn't happen that way. Even the Bible talks about it. Okay, so we know it didn't happen that way. But then Thursday is when Christ gets together with the disciples and he holds Eucharist, okay, the communion, for the first time. And it's their Passover celebration. And of course, he explains that this is my body, this is my blood. And he also calls out Judas and says, you're going to betray me. And then he also mentions to Peter that Peter will deny him 3 times at the end of this day. And so this is also the day after they perform the communion together. They also go to the Garden of Gethsemane and then all the events that transpired. This is when the Jewish and Roman authorities took hold of Christ and started putting him on trial. It apparently seems as if they went through the night with trials and the beatings that Christ endured. I would imagine that the Jews were the instigators of that they were pushing the Roman consulates and everybody to go ahead, let's do these trials, let's get him, we want this done. They were probably using arguments about that it was Passover, we didn't want a lot of, commotion, we just want to get it done, we want him out of the way. So they went through the night from Thursday to Friday, all night long. Christ was in front of officials and, defending himself, so to speak. So all of the things happen, and then on Friday morning, the 6th day, corresponding with the 6th day age of creation in which Christ was crucified, Jesus dies at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish timetable, you know that the day starts at dusk the previous night and goes through the night and includes all the daytime until dusk the next day. So dying at 9 o'clock in the morning is literally the middle of that day. The 6th day, both the day of the Lord, the day age in which Christ was crucified, same day of the week, of the crucifixion week, Friday, he dies. So he's in the grave. He's put in the grave on Friday during the day. So that's day 1. Saturday, he's in the grave all day. And this is, of course, the 7th day of the week. It is the Sabbath day, and it corresponds with the 7th day of creation. Sorry, guys. And then on Sunday, Christ is resurrected. The 8th day, it's the day after Sabbath. It's the 8th day he's resurrected. The day of spirituality. The day when Christ has a new body is the same day of the age of earth in which we will get a new body, in which all humanity will be changed. This is also the day on which the Jews celebrated the first fruits practice, the first fruits feast. The first fruits, as we know from 1 Corinthians 15, was about Christ being the first one to come out of the grave. And he dies or is resurrected on that day. I don't know if I hope you're catching on to what is being shown here. It's too big for words, okay? It's too big. What God did is too big. And what he's gonna do is too big. So I hope you see how clear the correlation is that God, through history, through so many different things, projected exactly what was going to happen. He projected it exactly. I just hope that you feel the gravity when you see that God molded all of history to his will. All of history, every single bit of it was crafted. Don't feel like that you're alone. You're never alone. God is so much bigger than we give him credit for. I can't overstate that. I cannot overstate God's hand in history. There's no way you can even get close to explaining it. I've tried in this video to get close. It's almost impossible. So I figured that at the end of this, some of you might be thinking, well, where are we on this timeline? You know, where are we? And so obviously we're here towards the end. And this is the circle where I thought that we really should put it. We're in this area. Obviously not past the great white throne judgment or the final coming of Christ. But we're somewhere inside that circle right before the 8th. Right before the middle of the 8th day. This day age is dedicated to the spirituality of mankind becoming made, becoming realized. Okay, we're at the end of the short season. We're looking forward to Christ coming and redeeming earth, redeeming everything. It's not going to be like any Tim LaHaye or Larry B. Jenkins or any of those guys. No Left Behind, no Late Great Planet Earth. It's not like that. But it's exactly as was talked about in the writings, and we just didn't listen. It's exactly like that. There are so many good things that are going to happen. So many good things. We should be praising and thanking him for his mighty majesty and everything he's done, and how he's brought us to this point in history, and how he's going to finish it. There's no mistakes here. There's no mistakes. He projected it in so many ways. We should know by now. What he's going to do. We should know by now. It's just that we were taught to ignore the sources of the information. We were taught to ignore the early church's writings and everything that was said. We were taught different ways of understanding what Christ was saying and what the apostles were saying. We were blinded to it in that way. And so I believe that that's why we have so many differing, varying opinions and things going on out there in the world of Christianity, different ways of understanding end times. It's because the truth of it, I think, has just been hidden and put on the back burner, put on the shelf. And to be honest, most people that study this stuff, I don't think are really giving their full devotion to it. Their full time, their full effort. They're not reading the right things or not finding the right pieces of information. And so we've never been taught how to correctly understand when an apostle says, is talking about us meeting him in the clouds. Or if a early Christian in the 1st or 2nd century is saying the coming of the Lord Jesus and the judging of the quick and the dead, what are they talking about? Well, most people haven't even read those writings. So that's why we get stuck in this quagmire of multiple interpretations, multiple denominations, multiple, even I would call them almost religions of eschatology. Whereas to me, it feels like it's been pretty clear. It's the baggage that we've brought that has made it so hard and so difficult to find the truth of what God's been showing us. He showed it to us with the Battle of Jericho. He showed it to us with the nation of Israel. He showed it to us with the circumcision rituals and even other rituals that the Jews did. He showed it to us even with the crucifixion week of his son, Jesus Christ himself. He showed us again what would happen. And with the judgment of the Jewish nation, he showed us so many things. All we have to do is really open our eyes and continue to read and not listen to the noise. Not listen to the noise that's out there. I thank you guys so much for the time you've spent with me. And I hope that I don't necessarily hope that you feel like I've given you every answer, although I think many have been given. But what I hope that it does is make you start afresh, start anew with some new lines of research, some new things, some realizations that perhaps, many people out there are very confused. And I hope that this has cleared up enough where, again, we're all on the same journey. We're all working towards understanding better. In my way, I have done that. And in your way, you will do that. And I hope this, again, clears up some things, gives you ammunition so that your research is better, is faster, and is more accurate. So with that, I will just say thank you for your time studying the 7 days of Earth history, and God bless.